Thank you so much for having me, Professor Melissa Steyn, whose work has been of immeasurable value to me. I also would like to thank, in absentia, Professor Sarah Ahmed, whose works I'm going to basically cite considerably from. I find myself in conversation with at least two of her works, Living a Feminist Life, published in 2017, and the Feminist Killjoy Handbook, published in 2023. If anybody would like to look at these books up close and personal, please feel free to come up later on and have a chat with me. I work with Sarah Ahmed's mapping of the feminist killjoy as cultural critic, when she considers the feminist killjoy's acquiring of happiness literacy, where happiness becomes the container for the diversity of human wants. Since happiness then can be understood as an end in the sense of what we aim to accomplish, happiness is the point of an existence. It would be necessary to home in then on whose happiness should be accorded primacy. I do not aim to provide conclusive statements about killjoys, feminist or otherwise. It is my hope rather to offer sites to explore aspects of global North higher education institutional landscapes, which may or may not elicit humorous responses depending on your own leanings. Perhaps these ruminations might work as invitations to ongoing decolonial conversations. Who is the feminist killjoy? Next slide, please. Sarah Ahmed provides us an idea of what we might expect. Historically, through minor references, the killjoy helped to create a picture of conviviality by embodying those who would bring an end to it. The killjoys would kill the joy of others, not their own joy, perhaps, because they do not have their own joy to kill. Ahmed identifies such embodiments of those who would bring an end to conviviality and indeed even joy in her Feminist Killjoy Handbook, published in 2023. Feminist killjoys can be scholars, poets, educators, activists, cultural critics, diversity workers. Many carry and perform multiple roles. I am a German scholar of color, working at a Bavarian university, which is the home institution to the Africa Multiple Cluster of Excellence, a transcontinental research cluster funded by the German Research Council. I bear several roles in my function as director of the Gender and Diversity Office. I wear several of these hats: as a gender studies scholar, as a university educator, as a cultural critic, as a diversity worker, as a woman of color living in a white majority society in the European global North. I consider that I might indeed be a feminist killjoy myself. After reading Sarah Ahmed's Living a Feminist Life, where in two conclusions to that work, she sets out the characteristics of feminist killjoyism as a mode of feminist life. The idea of the feminist killjoy resonated with me even more when I took on this job in April 2019 with this research cluster and found myself mobilizing various resources to help generate visions of reconfiguring African studies, which is a central mission and vision of this Africa Multiple Research Cluster. However, as you can probably imagine, being a woman scholar of color, a diversity practitioner, and a feminist killjoy of color in this global North higher education institutional space is not easy. I work with the concept of situated knowledges as part of the cultural diversity literary principles, which were set up by our host here at WiCDS. Interesting abbreviation here. I'm reminded of the musical Wicked, where there is a witch or two. Professor Melissa Steyn, who is the host here, as I said earlier on, the principles for critical diversity literacy have been immensely helpful, and I will bring up the one or the other principle during my talk today. Some of what I say today may resonate with some of you, despite the differences between global North and global South higher education institutional contexts. While engaging with Ahmed's mappings of feminist killjoy truths, maxims, commitments, works, positions, and philosophies, I've been mulling over how this figure kills joy. Whose joy is endangered here? What kinds of joy would warrant questioning, critiquing, indeed killing? When such joys are killed, what comes in to take their place? These are difficult questions indeed, especially at a conference devoted to the potentialities of humor and comedy as a means to name, critique, and resist injustice, discrimination, and othering. I do not claim to have the answers. Rather, I hope to articulate a few thoughts that have concerned me as an intersectional scholar, a critical diversity worker, and a German woman of color. Positionality is all, I think. There might be room to misunderstand the feminist killjoy as negative, but I find there is much to be learned from this figure, especially in this day and age when conversations appear to be nigh on impossible, and cancel culture is a reproach that is often randomly leveled at those who name, analyze, and call out systemic injustice. Next slide, please. Ahmed has pointed out in this vein, when the killjoy is used to picture a style of politics, it still brings with it a picture of a person who participates in what is now called cancel culture. If cancel culture is a new term, it is an old story. Here, it is notable that very often the reproach of cancel culture is expressed by those enjoying certain modes of privilege and power in hierarchical institutional structures. And these positions are racially and gender coded, although they seem to enjoy certain unmarked privileges, which allows certain power dynamics to reinforce privilege as normative, as normate, as normal. Generally, there seems to be a claim to happiness in such normalcy, a normative happiness that many take for granted, that is thought to be worth aspiring for, a normative happiness that is contingent on an old story. My contribution to the intended conversations here recognizes how humor and comedy are thought of as corollaries of happiness, which I connect with the idea of joy aligned with the figure of the feminist killjoy. So my question here is, what exactly might the feminist killjoy be intent on canceling then? What does the feminist killjoy want to set in place as a replacement? What does the feminist killjoy mean to change? Because that is what the feminist killjoy desires. Change. What do they want to change? Next slide, please. Ahmed states the following killjoy truth. You notice worlds when they are not built for you. When you try to fit a norm that is not shaped to fit your body, you create an incongruity or you become one. We might become more conscious of our bodies when we try to fit ourselves into a space that is not built for us. Killjoy philosophy gives us another way of thinking about thinking. We are thinking with and from our bodies. We philosophize because we are not accommodated. We philosophize when we are not accommodated. We become square pegs, misfits, killjoys when we have to keep demanding different entry points in order to get in. And this is where I see a connection to decolonial thinking, giving another way of thinking about thinking, unthinking the ways that we think right now and unlearning the ways of thinking that we have at the present. Killjoy philosophy, which is why I see the feminist killjoy as providing thought trajectories for decolonial feminism, and I'll get into this a little later. Following Ahmed's trajectories of thought in her handbook, I feel that feminist killjoys are about making space for racialized, gendered, and classed and disabled bodies, marginalized and vulnerable bodies. I posit that feminist killjoys are intersectional workers who recognize structural exclusions and systemic injustices. Feminist killjoys insist that certain bodies have been historically cancelled through colonial violence, are still being cancelled by hegemonic positions who claim modes of democratic representation for themselves. And there is an irony about this. I do not know if this can be seen as a mode of dark comedy. There are hegemonic voices claiming they are being cancelled when the marginalized and the vulnerable raise their voices to speak their truth to power. Next slide, please. Zimbabwean South African decolonial thinker Sabelo Ndlovu-Gatsheni has succinctly observed, what emerges poignantly is that the struggles to decolonize knowledge are never separate from other struggles against patriarchy, racism, sexism, capitalism, and other repressive, exploitative, and dehumanizing modern logics that underpinned the current world system and its shifting global orders. These struggles are made possible by the reality of the definitive entry of the descendants of the enslaved, colonized, and racialized people into the modern academies, forcefully proclaiming that they were born into valid and legitimate knowledge systems and that their lives matter. So here are those who are speaking up against being cancelled themselves historically. The question of cancel culture then bears some scrutiny then as to whose histories, stories, and cultures and voices have been cancelled and not willing to be silent. In higher education institutional contexts, the matter of cancel culture is connected to the vexed question of academic freedom, which is being mobilized, at least in German higher education context today, by white-positioned German scholars when critiques are directed at the persistence of colonial practices in knowledge production endeavors and relations. An example of such that has concerned many German scholars of color is a recent statement from the Academic Freedom Network in Germany, which states that, and I quote, "Critical voices are either ignored or dismissed with reflexive standard vocabulary." This is an open letter from the Academic Freedom Network to all universities in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland in the 27th of October, 2023. The open letter begins with a criticism of a mysterious entity designated as post-colonialism that is ostensibly being imposed on critical voices, resulting in, I quote, "discrimination, even a ban on speaking based on the skin color of the speaker," unquote. It bears thinking which critical voices are being ignored and dismissed as claimed here by this network, which articulates a predominantly white German majority hegemonic position where they ask, is a decolonization of science and research necessary? I have to admit, I did indulge in a dark chuckle or two reading this, noting the white fragility that accompanied this purported claim to be cancelled, just as much as the claim to being critical was asserted by the same voices who seem incapable of envisioning other critical voices who do not agree with the current state of research and teaching in German higher education institutions. Feminist killjoys are then aware of how happiness is claimed by those in power as recompense for the injury of exclusion, when critiques come from those with colonized histories, but who assert their own claims to happiness, the claims to the dignity of a good life as a democratic right. So taking a leaf out of Ahmed's handbook, I contend there is a need to consider happiness literacy as aligned with Melissa Stein's concept of critical diversity literacy as a necessary means of reading prevalent socio-political realities as multi-perspectival, embedded in power relations and subject to shifts, ambivalences, and possibilities that are accessible or not for, quote, those differently positioned with the unfolding dynamics of specific social contexts, unquote. Within specific German social contexts and relations, I have found it necessary to consider which desired ends guarantee modes of happiness and for whom. From a feminist killjoy perspective, the notion that happiness is what we all want and wish for begs the question of whose happiness is paramount and who is included in this we, which to all intents and appearances feels entitled to specific brands of happiness. Thus, feminist killjoys who notice worlds that are not built for the marginalized, the vulnerable, indeed for feminist killjoys themselves even, recognize that we are expected to feel and express gratitude for the little allowances, the little spaces made for us to exist and function as long as our square pegs do not disrupt white, round happiness. The next slide, please. So, wherever you find the figure of the killjoy, you will find a fantasy of happiness. To be a killjoy is to threaten not just happiness, but a fantasy of happiness, an idea of where and in whom happiness can be found. My feminist killjoy self has recognized that this fantasy of happiness from white colleagues doing African studies is expressed through a particular lament. Why can't we just be happy? I wonder what this happiness is made up of. An ostensible sense of family with Black scholars who are in knowledge production relations, as long as these are not critical of global North knowledge production practices? Is it a feel-good politics about one's white self being tolerant and benign towards Black scholars and scholars of color? Is it a sense of combining so-called good science with a generous, happy families type of complacence, because we're all just human beings after all. Pardon my sarcasm. This is where you will see me indulge in very silent, dark chuckles. I am chuckling, make no mistake. Indeed, all these are good, happy feelings that allow for some positions to feel safe in their comfort zones. It allows for a certain mode of blindness and amnesia towards colonial histories and neo-colonial exercises of power in academic spaces and contexts. My question here is, whose happiness is accorded primacy here in such academic relationalities? In this light, allow me to return briefly to the vexed question of academic freedom. I am a great friend of working definitions in order to get a handle on certain concepts that are often elusive despite their common use. Next slide, please. I found the following definition, working definition of academic freedom in a publication by a group of African studies scholars that could prove helpful for us to direct some critical attention to current notions of democracy and inclusivity in global North higher education institutions. Here we have a working definition taken from the 1997 UNESCO recommendation for, paragraph 17 for understanding what academic freedom could entail. There are 5 specific points here that have been laid out. Do please read them. I think these are things that we have to get a bit more conscious about when we talk about academic freedom. Academic freedom carries with it the fraught question of whose academic freedom and the concomitant happiness contained in this idea. If, according to the above definition, academic freedom is a democratic right, then the unhappiness expressed by those in privileged positions is questionable, since other critical voices claiming the above should be able to pursue their happiness by asserting these same democratic rights and engaging in these freedoms listed here. I will not pursue this trajectory at length here. I'm sure an entire symposium can be devoted to the questions of academic freedom for all, with a question mark at the end, and what feminist killjoys can say about the matter. Indeed, there might even be feminist killjoys who shared the sentiments set out by the above-mentioned Academic Freedom Network located in Germany. If anybody would like to see this, the English translation of that particular open letter, do come and see me. We'll need a bottle of wine as well, right? Okay, I'm just saying. Let me come back to the feminist killjoy and the matter of happiness literacy, which resonates for me with Melissa's critical diversity principle, number 9. Next slide, please. Principle number 9 points out the necessity of recognizing the role of emotions and emotional investments in considering power dynamics and social positioning. How are we taken up within the circulation of affect is at least partly constitutive of our felt embodiment within particular locations, and of how we fashion a sense of identity in relationship to social power. Processes of othering are crucial about impeding the current of positive affect towards those othered. To break these patterns, therefore, requires the education of the sentiments and sometimes uncomfortable emotional labor. Notably, Ahmed had expanded on the question of happiness literacy, addressing the uncomfortable but necessary emotional labor for feminist killjoys in institutional contexts. She speaks about how happiness is meant to be performed, next slide please, performed by Black women and women of color to ensure modes of emotional security in institutional life. A Black woman or woman of color might have to smile all the more because she's perceived as angry or too assertive. Smiling then becomes what you have to do in order to dislodge an expectation. Expectations can be confirmed by the very effort to dislodge them. Even a smile can be too assertive if you're already judged as being assertive. In my own context, there is a particular smile that I do wear, which then strikes terror in the heart of some of my colleagues. I'm not smiling that smile right now because I happen to like the people in this room. But these are part of the risks that come with the job. Do please bear with me. Thank you for your indulgence. Happiness is a form of emotional labor can be condensed in the formula, making others happy by appearing happy. Feminism might be what we need to resist this formula. You are no longer willing to appear happy or to become happy as you appear in order to make others happy. Feminism might matter at the other end of the formula. Yes, I am a feminist. Yes. Feminist killjoys and marginalized groups are expected to perform happiness to pacify dominant hierarchies, where these have allowed for institutional inclusion for certain types of bodies in order to fulfill diversity quotas, to feel good about themselves, to polish public images, and in some cases, actually envision and maybe even affect change. I'm not saying that good things don't happen, all right? Next slide, please. So Sarah Ahmed comes up with another killjoy commitment. I am willing to get in the way of feminist happiness. Women of color are asked to let go of our anger so white women can move on. Move on from what would be my question. Unless those problems were addressed, sisterhood, consciousness of a shared struggle would not be possible. When we speak about whiteness, we come up against whiteness as defensive feeling, sometimes as tears. As feminist philosopher Marilyn Frye has observed, it is often a requirement upon oppressed people that we smile and be cheerful. We comply. If we comply, we signify our docility and our acquiescence in our situation. Not smiling, not showing signs of gratitude, not being a cheerleader for the organization is sufficient to be heard as a killjoy, as not being compliant, as complaining, being demanding. But what are we demanding? What is interesting here is that there is a recognition of the unhappiness of Black women and women of color, indeed their anger, their grief. However, the expectation both at institutional and at interpersonal levels is that this anger needs to be let go of so as to ensure emotional equilibrium in institutional as well as, in this case, feminist disciplinary contexts. Because we are professional, are we not? Be professional or die. Ahmed names whiteness here as a critical site for interrogation of power relations, where marginalized groups' unhappiness is to be forgone, glossed over, held to be irrelevant. She states unequivocally, next slide, please. Freedom, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, okay, there was another one there. Yeah, sorry, I'll need to carry on with that. The feminist killjoy's refusal to be a caregiver and a cheerleader for the organization is often read in turn by representatives of the organization of those who belong and who are in their comfort zone as a feminist threat to the establishment. The figure of the feminist killjoy teaches us how the minimization of harm and the inflation of power often work together, even to identify something as harmful is treated as an attempt to exercise or to hold power over someone, as if feminists make slights bigger than they are to make themselves bigger. Now, when I read this, I had to laugh. This idea that as a feminist killjoy, if you're pointing out structural injustices, you actually are holding power over someone. Interesting idea. I've never felt it in the course of my job, but we can talk about it, right? Interestingly, those who name and call out oppressive power dynamics are seen as harmful, as oppressively holding power over the institution. What a role reversal. This in itself requires some attention as regards positioning and power relations in structural hierarchies, who are doing those who have suffered and who are doing the necessary work to point out injustices, who stay with the trouble, are now being made out to be the villains of the piece. Such are the workings of a certain type of white innocence, or should I say the arrogance of ignorance. We'll see. Thus, the figure of the feminist killjoy, be it in her avatars of cultural critic, poet, philosopher, or activist, and I would add educator, public intellectual, and researcher, can kill joy just by not being made happy by the right things. And here again, we should ask who defines what are the right things. One might ask, what are the right things that a feminist killjoy might not be happy about? Whose joy and happiness might a feminist killjoy kill? What types of joy might be endangered by feminist killjoys? I think you realize now there's a refrain here, yes? okay? Whose happiness are we looking at? Whose happiness needs to be saved? This is mind-boggling for me on several levels, but I embarked on finding out what this is that the feminist killjoy might be up against. What is this elusive everything? Some idea of this everything is provided, next slide please, by Patricia Daly and Amber Murray in their seminal 2023 volume, Learning Disobedience. They say, feminists have long asserted that our words are life, that our words, our terms, our concepts carry political, social, economic, and geographical significance. The theft and misappropriation of ideas occurs within and brings attention to the concurrent and permanent orders of racialized and gendered violence that are simultaneously standardized within racial capitalism, with each violence building upon and also only occurring within and because of the multiplicity of colonial racialized violence. So this unsmiling insistence on the value of feminist and gender studies scholarship, and I should include here post-colonial and decolonial scholarships as well, bears a distinct feminist killjoy insistence on how the coloniality of power still operates during our current times of ostensibly objective and democratic academic endeavor, through willful misreadings of these scholarships while asserting business as usual attitudes with pretensions to good science and objectivity. What Murray and Daly identify as the misappropriation of ideas is currently rampant amongst both scholars and participants and politicians who are not conversant in post-colonial theory or gender studies in order to shut down experts, killjoys from these fields in order to maintain the status quo. Where is the joy in that? I reckon the coloniality of power has come into its neo-colonial heyday. In this light, I take another point of departure in search of that elusive everything. Next slide, please. From Robtel Njai Paley's 2019 insistence on decentering the white gaze, which she identifies as the white gaze of development, measures the political, socio-economic, and cultural processes of Southern Black, Brown, and other people of color against the standard of Northern whiteness, and finds them incomplete, wanting, inferior, or regressive. So this is this elusive everything that the feminist killjoy goes up against. It takes the shape in the form of a gaze. I'm getting vibes here from Tolkien's fiery eye of Sauron sitting on top of the Tower of Barad-dûr. I'm a Tolkien fan as well, excuse me. I find Paley's analysis of the white gaze aligned, next slide please, with Donna Haraway's concept of the God trick. Haraway defines the God trick as, this is the gaze that mythically inscribes all marked bodies, that makes the unmarked category claim the power to see and not be seen, to represent while escaping representation. This gaze signifies the unmarked positions of man and white, one of the many nasty tones of the word objectivity to feminist ears in scientific, later industrial, militarized, racist, and male-dominant societies. The God trick of the white gaze, thus gendered and racialized as an unmarked, cis, heteropatriarchal, ontological, and epistemological site and practice, ascribes to ideas of objectivity and rationality, qualities defining specifically white masculinized, heteronormative contours of idealized citizenship, often marked as a default understanding of the human condition. The Caribbean philosopher Sylvia Wynter has much to say about this when she talks about man one and man two. While many colleagues may say that the God trick concept is old hat, I maintain in feminist killjoy fashion, of course, that given the current backlash against gender studies, post-colonial studies, and decolonial studies, with a notable lack of objectivity and rationality, I might add, the idea of the God trick merits some renewed scrutiny, especially as regards the nebulous everything that the feminist killjoy appears to act against. My suturing of the white gaze to the phenomenon of the God trick aligns my own epistemic and political unhappiness with dissenting critical gazes of Black scholars, Black gender studies scholars and other gender studies scholars of color which is directed against the God trick. Hence, I read the feminist killjoy's mission as running constant interference and disruption of the God trick. And this is a major mode of navigation of normativity. Perhaps I should mention in that my reflections on the feminist killjoy and happiness here stem from a publication that I'm currently working on that reflects a particular feminist killjoy equation. Next slide, please, which is posited by Ahmed, where feminist killjoys are alienated by how they themselves are affected as citizens, scholars, philosophers, poets, cultural critics, and so on. She talks about white feminism as a form of blanking. I experienced this personally at a 2009 conference in Frankfurt in Germany, entitled Celebrating Intersectionality. I'm archiving this moment and another specific moment. Interestingly, they were both anniversary conferences, by the way, and we are at an anniversary conference right now. So yeah, interesting coincidence. And both occasions concern gender studies in the German academic landscape. Interestingly enough, Black German scholars were not invited to the 2009 Intersectionality Conference. A lot has been written about it. Quite a few white feminist, European white feminist scholars have written about it. One such publication also comes up with this idea of who owns intersectionality, which I find very interestingly colonial, but that's another talk for another day. I think what's important here again is that Black women scholars and women scholars of color are still being seen as strangers, seen as not from here, not belonging, as bodies out of place. So when we become strangers, says Ahmed, we end up in the edges of rooms as well as conversations, not part of us, not like us, not with us. Again, the happiness of us seems to be paramount. Who is this us? I am always at pains to identify. In the German context, it would be necessary to also consider how white feminist and gender studies standpoints, often inhabited by female and feminine identifying bodies, have internalized and mobilized the very same God trick when eliding, erasing, and silencing Black and people of color, gender and feminist scholarship and standpoints. By, interestingly enough, by not seeing race as a salient and a volatile category that still shapes life, worlds, and relations in German contexts. So you see, if we don't see race, there's no racism. So therefore, we cannot talk about race or racism, which is kind of difficult if you want to celebrate intersectionality. I'm just saying. Yeah, okay. And yet there are interesting moves to claim ownership over certain Black feminist theories to whiten them. The idea of blanking bears some scrutiny. And this in themselves demonstrates the coloniality of race and white privilege still at work. I speak from my own understanding of diversity work as a mode of feminist killjoyism in the German cluster context. When I started my work as a diversity officer with this cluster, I saw the necessity to facilitate conversation with African women scholars, considering the visibility of African women scholars and their scholarship and the visibility of their scholarship in academic contexts and spaces. And I find these necessary aspects of reconfiguring African studies. My toolbox contained intersectional and critical diversity approaches, as well as a distinct recognition of the necessity of decolonial aspects in this reconfiguring agenda. It was important to work consciously with the African Knowledge Archive as a necessary step. This requires recognizing African women scholars have been bringing their perspectives, processes, and politics to academic spaces where teaching and research are done. I note that a general epistemic anxiety has made itself felt both in global North and academic contexts, global North and global South academic contexts. And I'm saying global South because I encountered this amongst several of my colleagues in our African partner universities. And this is the fear. Gender studies might take away from the robustness of African studies. Again, dark chuckles. Or not. So African gender concerns and theorizations are feared, are considered, relegated to mere identity politics. And there is the fear that African gender theorizations might actually divert the necessary attention from more serious concerns in African studies, whatever these may be. And yet, when considering research problems, questions, and agendas raised for discussion, critical diversity and intersectional aspects of gender, power, colonial and neo-colonial historicization and memory work, systemic injustice, precarious marginality, and the relative invisibility of vulnerable groups are ever present. Among several questions, I focus on the following in my gender and diversity work for Africa Multiple. Number one, how are African and Black women's voices and knowledges being included in research communities to effect the necessary decolonial revisioning of disciplines through depatriarchization, as Sabelo Ndlovu-Ngacheni has observed in his article in Third World Quarterly of 2020, The Cognitive Empire? Are these voices and scholarships being mobilized in modes of ethical and socially responsible scholarship? What kinds of resources are being made available for African and Black women researchers and knowledge producers in higher education contexts on the continent and in the diasporas? At this point, I note, at least in the German academic context, these feminist killjoy questions irritate and disrupt the calm joys hitherto found in German modes of African studies scholarship at the institution where I work. These irritations are expressed with eye rolling and reproaches of moralizing and outcries. Do we have to reconfigure African studies according to the GDO's precepts? So you see, I'm quite the Philistine. I said once before, thank you for having space for small people, small bodies, short people. Very often, when considering the pertinence of gender studies approaches to African studies, the generic understanding is that the transdisciplinary field of gender studies focuses exclusively on women's issues. Gender studies includes masculinity studies, queer studies, intersectionality studies, amongst various other things, as we all know. At least I hope so. Intersectionality studies, this last being an important contribution from Black feminist studies in particular, which is pertinent to African studies, whereby African feminist killjoys like Sylvia Tamale and Akona Ken Kana have been vocal about the contributions of African feminist studies to academic disciplines. Here, it would be worth it also to note Bagele Chilisat's insights on the shared principles of African feminist scholarship and Black feminist scholarship, which encompass contextual and cultural complexity, comprehensiveness, self-determination, liberation, spirituality, community, and praxis. This can be found in Bagele Chilisa's Indigenous Research Methodologies, published in 2020. Notably, similar reflections have been put forward by African masculinity studies scholars like Kopano Ratele, Ola Jamuke, Jacob Haliso, Akusua Adomako, and Pofo, to name just a few. While women's issues have been brought to the forefront by feminist and gender studies scholars in African studies, as well as in other disciplines by and large, at least 3 academic attitudes arise connected to research agendas, aims, methodologies, and impacts, which are a cause for concern for a feminist killjoy. And I'm talking about attitudes like attitude, okay? So number 1, women's issues do not seem to merit serious epistemic engagement as part of research agendas in the purview of African studies. These are relegated to the silo of gender studies to be carried out exclusively by gender scholars. So only one set of people can do the work, yeah? Everybody else sits back and relaxes. Wonderful. Number 2, another attitude. Women's issues are often dealt with as though these are segregated from all other socio-political and cultural matters and relations, while an unmarked, universal, cis, heteropatriarchal, and masculinist lens is privileged as a generic, normative, objective, rational, qualitatively superior knowledge production perspective and criterion of best practice and academic context. Do you know how frustrating this is? Yes, dark chuckles again. African feminist and gender studies scholarships are barely considered in research contexts, much less integrated in terms of research approaches and practices as part of robust, reflexive, and thick methodological trajectories. These concerns then beg the question of the level and context of unbelonging Number one, of African women, their citizenship status and rights, and their epistemic perspectives in African life worlds and worldviews. Number two, their levels and context of unbelonging of African women's knowledge production in academic, activist, and artistic arenas in the transdisciplinary field of African studies. Again, these are some of the more frustrating aspects of my work in this cluster. It's a transcontinental cluster. We work from German situated standpoints, but I also engage with our African partner universities, and it's not an easy job. The conversations are difficult, they're ongoing, I do not see them as closed. Thus, it is clear that the question of women's issues stands in complex relation to men's matters. More informed perspectives on gender studies thus consider masculinity and queer studies alongside women's issues. These are contingent on the plethora of research questions evoked to address contemporary and historical problems in African life worlds and contexts. Historical considerations of gender questions show that colonizer patriarchy, previously unknown to African societies, as Sylvia Tamale states, significantly diminished women's socio-political status, giving rise to the capitalist patriarchy born out of Western hegemonic worldviews, which construct the generic human subject and citizen as male, where, quote, institutions and ideologies are male-dominated, pushing more than half of the continent's population into the margins of social existence. This colonizer patriarchy, next slide please, has also been theorized by Argentinian feminist philosopher Maria Lugones in her seminal essays Coloniality of Gender, published in 2008, and Towards a Decolonial Feminism, published in 2010. She says, the coloniality of gender is still with us. It is what lies at the intersection of gender, class, race, as central constructs of the capitalist world system of power. Decolonizing gender is necessarily a practical task. It is to enact the critique of racialized, colonial, and capitalist heterosexualist general oppression as a lived transformation of the social. I call the analysis of racialized, capitalized gender oppression the coloniality of gender. I called the possibility of overcoming the coloniality of gender decolonial feminism. As regards African academic contexts, I see Ugandan legal studies scholar and feminist Killjoy Sylvia Tamale's confrontation of the God trick. Next slide, please. When she critiques the structural alienation and exclusionary politics against African women scholars in university settings as an example of marginalization. I can only recommend this book, very insightful. It's an exciting read, Decolonization and Afrofeminism, published in Ottawa, but with Daraja Press in 2020. The conditions for Black women scholars in African higher education contexts enumerated by Tamale thus demonstrate how the God trick still works. Cis heteropatriarchal modes of policing and gatekeeping that are invested in the gender divisions of labor. These concerns align with questions around diversity, alluding to the management of difference at institutional levels in order to maintain some preconceived notions of order entertained by mainstream positionalities. When I raise similar matters for conversation, I find myself confronted with interesting stonewalling strategies using variations of the God trick, also undertaken by several male colleagues from African institutions who insist that their institutions have, I quote, enough women visible in key positions, and thus there is no need to have these conversations in the purview of the cluster's reconfiguring work. Apparently, the institution has done its diversity due diligence. I also noted that some African women scholars claim to do good science within the frameworks of expected gender relations, explaining these relations as maintaining cultural integrity. To this, next slide, please. I can only bring in Afrofeminist Killjoy Akona Kenkane's observation that an analysis and conception of gender shall not be narrowed down to just an oppression of one by the other, but rather the conception of gender as a systematic and structural phenomenon inherited from the colonial forms of power. The importance of digging deeper than the numbers game or statistical representation cannot be overemphasized. And yet the diversity strategy par excellence in many global North higher education institutions is to bring in those few token Black and brown women in positions, but not necessarily to take their knowledges and their scholarship seriously. However, as Sarah Ahmed has observed, diversity can function as a containment strategy. Notably, through higher education, although higher education institutions may subscribe to diversity management, which encompasses ideals of equity, equal opportunity, and inclusion, often the case is that, I quote, institutional preference for the term diversity is a sign of the lack of commitment to change and might even allow organizations such as the universities to conceal the operation of systematic inequalities, unquote. As a critical diversity worker, at the interface of research and administration in my own function at Africa Multiple, I have noted rather troubling stances entertained by many Global North scholars in my own higher education institution towards the Gender and Diversity Office. And one such attitude is the Gender and Diversity Office is merely a care service provider, where women's issues concerning childcare support seems to be the only issue that is recognized. There seems to be a diversity tick box at the administrative level of the institution, transporting a satisfaction in promoting the so-called family-friendly university, while discounting other epistemological sites of interrogation of power relations in research, institutional spaces, and relations, as well as actual methodological parameters concerning research agendas and substance. At this point, I should say, working with intersectionality theory and with Melissa's critical diversity principles, I was able to set up a catalog of hard criteria for gender and diversity work at the university within the cluster's purview. I'm struck by yet another astute observation by Sylvia Tamale. Next slide, please. As regards gender-related diversity work in African university contexts. And in some cases, this is also applicable to to diversity workers of color in German university contexts. She says, it is quite paradoxical that institutions largely leave the weight of addressing gender-related inequities to female academics, but when at it, they are promptly policed to ensure they do not upset the capitalist heteropatriarchal order. Ultimately, such policing has the debilitating effect of impeding women's academic and intellectual work, not to mention violating their fundamental freedoms and dignity. Whose happiness are we looking at? I find myself returning to Tamale's as well as Ahmed's works when I'm confronted with eye-rolling responses that are shot my way when I address structural inequalities, indifference to the problems faced by Black scholars and scholars of color in German higher education institutions. When I point out the double standards as regards the applications of rights and regulations, the kinds of power play, and attempts to subjugate and manipulate me as a diversity worker by certain scholars, both white scholars as well as Black scholars and scholars of color, because of some preconceived idea that my office exists for so-called trivialities. Recognizing, naming, and analyzing the diverse implementations of power while experiencing these as a raced, gendered, and classed scholar and diversity practitioner can produce darkly humorous accounts, which then serve to expand my stock of knowledge and my professional resilience. This is labor, which as rewarding as it may be on some counts, is proving to be exhausting on many levels, especially given the current political developments where the far right has gained considerable ground in German-speaking countries. Coming back to the business of happiness literacy, as a necessary tool in the feminist Killjoy toolkit. Next slide, please. I turn to Ahmed's Killjoy equation that states, so many feminist Killjoy stories begin with an experience of not finding something funny. When you are heard as having a chip on your shoulder, a grievance on being dismissed as a grudge, as if you're only making a complaint because you are sore, the very fact of being different is used to explain and dismiss what you are saying. To become a feminist killjoy is to hear how we are dismissed. Feminist killjoys are often deemed oversensitive. Killjoy equation, oversensitive equals sensitive to what is not over. It is this sensitivity to what is not over, and we all know that we do not live in a post-racial, post-gender, post-feminist, or post-colonial world, which pushes me to interrogate whose happiness is considered important, whose rights are recognized, and whether institutions really are invested in necessary change, since many have realized that something is not quite right. They too are cognizant of that which is not over. Considering happiness as a significant mode of affect connected to idealized and desired modes of being and belonging in the world, I would posit a conditionality of happiness at work and higher education spaces, and possibly many others at the moment. I turn one last time today to Sarah Ahmed's 2010, The Promise of Happiness. Next slide, please, where she elaborates. It might seem that what I'm calling conditional happiness involves a relationship of care and reciprocity, as if to say, I will not have a share in a happiness that cannot be shared. And yet the terms of conditionality are unequal. If certain people come first, we might say those who are already in place, such as hosts or citizens, then their happiness comes first. Conditional happiness would require that I take up what makes you happy as what makes me happy, which may involve compromising my own idea of happiness. Thus, as a feminist killjoy exercises their own killjoy care by reflecting on unequal relationalities, while refusing to do care work to uphold institutional affective equilibriums. Rather, the feminist killjoy insists on the recognition that one party's happiness is made contingent on compromising, possibly even negating another party's happiness, whereby happiness, for my purposes here, is contiguous with perceptions of democratic citizen rights and epistemic definitional authority. Who speaks, who is allowed to speak, and who is heard. I thank you for listening.
Much for the excellent presentation, and I'm sure there are quite a lot of reflections to the presentation that we've just listened to. But while you think of questions and write notes, I just have a few reflections to sort of recapture, but also engage with the presentation that has been laid before us. And I think one of the most amusing points I found in your presentation, Doc, is around the neoliberal and neocolonial construction of happiness. And I also thought about the ideas around fulfillment and inclusivity, sort of whose models and whose frameworks are we using to come up with definitions of institutional inclusivity and various forms of social justice. And I also thought that the neoliberal notions of individuality and contestations between who has more rights than the others, particularly streamed on a gender basis, is very important. And one of the other things that also, one of the other questions that also came out as a way to provoke thoughts is who is actually promised happiness and what are the objects of such happiness? So how is that happiness then mediated? What kind of work are women given in institutions as ways of being told how to behave, but also with the promise of open quote, happiness, close quote. So are these things such as care work, admin, mentorship roles, and anything that relates to the, that has less to do with sort of what others would consider mainstream intellectual work. I also like the reflections or your inputs on the question of a good life, where you find that this idea of a good life tends to maintain the hegemonic order and also some of the institutional rewards that that relate to that. And lastly, I was also thinking about institutions and the organization and your provocative input around not cheerleading the organization. And it also had me thinking about who is the organization, what is the organization, and actually critiquing the term organization itself, because it does maybe suggest that there's a certain order, a certain way that reinforces the social political organization out there. So going through with that thought. and also the numbers game, that most institutions tend to then narrow it down to the numbers, with so many numbers of black women, with this number of queer people in the space, people living with disabilities, but then that does not necessarily capture the experiences. I think, to borrow from a sporting example, for those who watch soccer, there are people that say when you watch football, that football stats don't tell the entire picture, right? So they don't necessarily, to some degree, capture the nuances. They don't capture some of the other moments or experiences that cannot be quantified into the numbers or quantitative game. So, Prof, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I'm going to open up for at least 4 or 5 questions, and they're going to be taken all at once.
You sure they're going to be 4 or 5? Everybody looks very tired. And many have already hightailed it out of here.
Okay, please give us 4 or 5, colleagues.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you, Prof, Doctor. I'm not sure which it is, both and maybe. Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed your presentation. You know, as someone who uses Ahmed's work and is a fan of her work, I enjoyed the ways that I think you tied it to other theories. I've talked with the God trick before. I didn't know that it was out of fashion. I thought it was still in fashion.
I was told there are people who are tired of reading Haraway. I don't know why, but I think there are still productive ways in which we can still engage with some of the leading feminist theorists from the 80s and the 90s.
I think so too. And I liked how you also linked it to Sylvia Tamale now, more currently. So I think my question, the other connection that I really enjoyed hearing you speak to was, yeah, between the feminist killjoy and cancel culture. And I haven't had the pleasure of reading Ahmed's book yet, but I've listened to a lot of her talks and interviews. And I remember one interview she was doing, she was talking about part of also the feminist killjoy is to know also sometimes when you need to kill your own joy. And I was thinking about what you were saying about, you know, white feminism, and thinking about, you know, some of the experiences, some of your own experiences that you talked about, particularly I imagine a lot of white women participating, yeah, in that kind of fantasy of happiness, I think, as you described it. So I mean, and as myself as a white woman and a feminist, you know, I think about, yeah, the killjoy as also perhaps, yeah, killing my own joy at times, killing or canceling. Yeah, I would just like to hear you speak to that, maybe, if you think that that's a productive way of thinking about also linking the killjoy to a kind of canceling of the white self, or other dominant positionalities for that matter. Yeah, as a kind of killing of one's own joy, and canceling of oneself.
Yeah, I think, first of all, the way I read Ahmed, I don't necessarily see her as advocating killing whiteness. I think what she's basically saying is that, you know, in your joys, do not forget the sorrows of others, right? Okay, if you pack that into a single sentence. What she's saying is that think about whether or not your joy is actually at somebody else's expense, right? And why should that be? For example, why is it that these white German feminists basically felt that they wanted to celebrate intersectionality in a German context and decide that they were not going to invite Black German feminist scholars? Why is it then that while they were indulging in that particular white German framework, and when there were Black and other feminists of color standing up in the audience, myself included, to ask, excuse me, we are talking about 20 years of intersectionality here. You're celebrating this, you know, watershed moment. Where are the Black German feminist scholars who will have something to say about this? Nobody said anything. And then there was this business about race, class, and gender. And was like, okay, how is it being addressed here within intersectionality scholarship in German context? And one person jumps up, a white feminist jumps up to say, oh no, we're not going to look at race. Because looking at race in the German, with this very sensitive history that we have, we can't possibly look at race now because that would be racist. Yes, chuckle, please chuckle, indeed. These are those moments of dark humor where you're I'm sorry. See, even the equipment is reacting. Okay, there's some vibes here, man. Vibes, yeah. So this white feminist self, an academic self, intent on celebrating this anniversary, right? Basically decided that a particular socio-political category, which has so much impact and shapes the lives of so many Black Germans and other German people of color, suddenly was in their remit and in their decision-making process, suddenly declared null and void, because we had to pay attention to the painful German history. So if we look at race, that is racist. So that in itself, that very strange logic in itself was racist. Whose joy was being made paramount here? There were several of us, scholars of color, Black scholars, we went there, they, oh wow, yeah, 20 years of celebrating intersectionality. Finally, we're going to see a few more people coming to the table. No, they had a couple of Black British scholars and they had a Black Dutch scholar, and they flew in Kimberly Crenshaw. But the rest of us. So that's just an example to say, while you're celebrating, while you're so focused and invested in this institutional happiness where you say, all right, look, we've got the balance, can you please look on whose back that balance is being built on? Because very often those backs are also rendered invisible, right? So yeah, some of us felt joy at that moment. Yeah, okay. But imagine how our joy then just crashed and burned, seeing that there wasn't a single Black German scholar at the table to have that conversation. So who is actually then thought of as belonging to that particular us in German gender studies? Yeah. That's just one example. I hope that gives you an idea of where I'm trying to go with this. I don't believe in having conclusive conversations in the sense that I bring conversation to an end. You know, part of my decolonial trajectory is also to keep, sites of engagement open, because we're not out of the woods yet. I'm just saying, a bit pessimistic, I know, but there we have it.
We've got two here.
All right.
Thank you so much for your presentation. A really delightful, at the same time, quite unnerving, of course. So thank you so much. I wanted to, for you to maybe speak on the concept that you're using of dark humor and how you actually also utilize it in your presentation and how you deliver the content and everything. But also, what is then for you the role of the comedy itself? So is it, because I think there is also a big difference between comedy and humor itself, right? Because comedy does something else, but humor also has a, so perhaps maybe just to think through the idea that how then also how women of color use humor to disrupt themselves or disrupt spaces, and to think through this idea of joy making even, because kind of like sometimes when we do this humor moment, it is, and it's a very joy-making moment. It is that emotional labor of trying to make the situation placate everyone. But at the same time, it is a way of also, doing a counter resistance of some sort. And you use it so beautifully and excitingly, and so and in the way that allows also for possibilities for someone else who's listening to you to go, oh my God, oh yes, so one becomes not only a co-conspirator with you around, oh, this is how we organize, this is how we create, this is how we make. So perhaps if you could just explore just a little bit again, your dark comedy concept and humor. Thank you. Then I'll give over to our colleague here.
I would perhaps suggest responding to that because I wanted to address an earlier comment, and it was an act of erasure that we were all a part of that I realized we didn't address then. So I'd invite perhaps an initial response before just addressing that act of erasure that happened. And I'll elaborate on that later because it's going to break the flow of this conversation perhaps. Or shall I name? Okay, so the point was that there were two respondents who said the stand-up comedy is male dominated, and it erased a lot of the female stand-up comedians in South Africa who were present. I just want to name them because I don't want to remain complicit to that statement, because I think their erasure is a capitalist and platform problem rather than a gender problem in the profession. So I wanted to name Nina Hastings, Tumi Morake, Celestine Tuli, Stella Dlangalala, and Leseho Tladi in counter to that action. I understood the flow of the conversation. I was complicit too, but I was like, in your presentation, I realized that we'd done that we just made stand-up comedy in South Africa male-dominated, which it's not. It's an issue of a capitalist and platforming in terms of the media dominance in South Africa's construct rather than the action of the industry.
Can I just ask, why is that not a gender problem?
I think how I heard it phrased in the conversation, for me, there was a dangerous misalignment that was present as I interpreted it, which made it seem as though it was all a gender problem, which it is not. There was the lack of nuancing the fact that it's a capitalist platforming bias that we have in our sector. So yes, perhaps even in my phrasing now, thank you for that check. It is also a gender issue, but I think the way it was named in the room, I was left uncomfortable with.
This is where I just suggest maybe trying to adopt a more intersectional lens, because we don't do single issue politics, yeah, like Audre Lorde says, yeah, okay. And if it has been set up as a male dominated profession, and that needs to be interrogated, as you very, very rightly said. It's not just a matter of capitalist structures itself. It's also how capitalism then works with the patriarchy, works with masculinist, androcentric points of view, all of which are gendered stances. Yeah. So I'm still going to keep on advocating looking at intersectionality as a viable and flexible instrument. Yeah, I'm not saying it's perfect. I've got colleagues from my African partner institutions tell me, hey, intersectionality, all that Black American stuff, man, got nothing to do with us here. And I'm like, yeah, okay, fine. It comes from a Black American context, but it's a Black American context in that feminist work doesn't necessarily work only with the US. Black feminists in the US still think transnationally. So there are conversations going on with Afro-feminists. So maybe that can also just be factored in as part of your methodology. That's all I'm saying. Yeah. Was that the only intervention? Yeah, okay, and yeah, and yours, yeah, I like, yeah. I don't like to use the word gallows humor. There's something so final about it. There's something so deathly about it. You know, so like Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows sort of thing. Dark humor in the sense that there's a shadowy underbelly to the type of uses that humor can be put to, right? And this idea to counter resistance. I've had to inculcate that sort of humor in my work because it helps me come back to my work in a more resilient fashion, because believe you me, it is very, very painful sometimes. So humor is a necessary part of my survival kit. And when I do meet kindred spirits, they can be Black feminist scholars, feminist scholars of color, certain white feminists as well. Melissa is one of these people who I love to have a round of trash talk with once in a while. Trash talking helps a lot, right? I'm not going to divulge all the secrets, but yeah, there are moments where you find your own community, right? Working with Sabelo Ndlovu Gacheni, for example, he keeps on saying, are you gathering your people? Are you gathering your community? And sometimes when things are painful, you need to try and sort of allocate a certain level of irreverence to that particular racist incident, racist sexist incident, whatever it is. Understand and realize that it is painful, it is systemic injustice, people have been hurt by it, somebody is suffering by it, and yet at the same time, how to deal with it, sometimes, you just have to find ways and means. And community can be very helpful that way. If you've noticed, while I was speaking, I did not smile. I try not to smile. Okay? Because for me, very often in my job, there's nothing to smile about. You might see a smirk, a sarcastic twitch of the lips, a raised eyebrow, like my picture that I sent to Melissa. When people see that eyebrow go up, they know they're in trouble. You see? Yeah, so why are they in trouble? I'll let them know. I'm a straight talker. And this is one of the reasons why I am not a popular person in my professional space. It is very, very hard as well to maintain your integrity, because in the purview of your job, you are expected to behave like a caregiver. But you know what? They only want to see your hands. The rest of you disappears as a person. Yeah? So you're the gender and diversity officer. Get me money for childcare. Or, oh, we have to do such and such a process. Why don't you just sort of soften those rules a bit? I said, no, I'm sorry. I still have to work within these structures. I'm trying very hard to do my own bit to decolonize structures so that these principles, the critical diversity principles, the ideas behind intersectionality, that we don't have single issue lives and we don't do single issue politics. These are things I'm trying to bring into the everyday of research work and research relationality as part of our institutional culture. And it's not easy if your colleagues all want to stay in the comfort zone and carry on doing business as usual, right? And it's very, very hard. It's very, very hard when you are mobilizing 60 to 70 years worth of gender studies scholarship, Black feminist scholarship, and decolonial scholarship. And have you read this? Have you read this? You haven't read this. Why not? You're African studies people. What's wrong with you? This is not easy because your office as a gender and diversity officer is just seen to be a so-called caregiving office, and care in the most rudimentary understanding, right? We cater to those needs as well. That's not to say we ignore that. The materiality of childcare is very difficult. Yeah? But at the same time, there are other types of care. Care for our discipline, care for African studies as a transdisciplinary field, care for the actual institution, care for the people in those institutions who are trying to do this work. Sometimes I have to, as a feminist killjoy, appear not to care in order to care in the greater scheme of things. And sometimes I have to not take myself so seriously in order to take myself seriously. And this is where that form of humor actually helps. I think somebody said that earlier on. I mean, because if you don't laugh, what are you going to do? Just dissolve in a puddle of tears, yes? Trust me, the job I'm doing, no place for puddles. No, we have to stand. I've still got work to do. And so do you. I'm smiling now. I shall have a glass of wine later. Yes.
Thank you so much for that Wonderful presentation, Bob.